Hello, everyone. I was asked to do this because I had was teaching and back in 1950s, and you remember this was wartime. So at Stanford, we did not have much in the way of athletics. A few intramural athletics, and pretty much the few men that were there and the girls had no trouble sharing what was there. Each had pretty much their own facilities. And so I was rarely ever involved in all the things that happened later, except my daughter. One daughter went to Bowdoin and had to give up the tennis courts on the best hours to the men. And I have very little experience with oarsmen. I never was even near a shell. I did teach canoeing at Wellesley, but that was recreational. And so reading this book really gives you an insight into what, as we used to say, these crazy girls who got up at 5 a.m. did. And it's an insight. And now Ginny is into my favorite, basketball. So maybe we'll hear a little bit about that.
You guys won't think I'm being too formal if I'm up here and say, oh, no. What did I just do? We cannot see you. Okay. Thank you. Is this in the right place? Can people hear me? I have to say, this is like the best place to do anything, much less come and talk about books. It is what I grew up on the East Coast. I've actually lived in Seattle now for 30 years. This is my 30th anniversary, actually. Well, it was last month. And I said to my hosts, my newest, oldest best friends, I call them, that if I had come here, I would never have moved out west. So I'm very glad this is my first time, because actually Seattle is great. I really appreciate your coming. I'll do a little reading, but really, whenever I have listened to authors, I've been interested in their process, how they came to write the book, and not so much about the book itself. I figure you can read the book, but I should talk to you about some things that aren't in the book. So, of course, I love to take questions, so I'll try to pay attention to the time, because it's always more interesting to hear you guys talk and ask what you're interested in than to hear myself. So the first thing that I like to... Oh, hold on. I got to move this. There we go. Sorry. I was kicking the water. So, I'm in my mid-50s, or maybe I'm in my late 50s now. So, whatever. I do it by thirds, so I'm kind of in my third of my 50s. So a lot of people, I'm not a writer by career, so a lot of people have said, why did you write a book now? And when I was younger, I grew up reading Harriet the Spy. How many people remember Harriet the Spy? Okay, so I started out keeping my little notebook, and I started a novel when I was 12, which I abandoned. And then life kind of took its course, and I ended up becoming an athlete and never made it into the world of writing. I started out majoring in English at Yale, but because you didn't have to write a senior essay, if you were an English major, I needed something harder. I decided I had to major in something where I was going to write a senior essay, so I majored in history. So I did a lot of writing in college. My first professor, I think my first grade was a C-. It was horrendously hard and very humiliating, that first class. But I learned how to write thanks to Yale English profs. So I spent a lot of my early career in business and obviously rowing. But in 2008, we were watching the Olympics, and my kids grew up, they were only allowed to watch the Olympics on TV, pretty much. So even though it was beautiful weather like this, we were lying around inside watching the Olympics in early August 2008. And we were watching swimming, and there was a woman, Dara Torres. Anybody know Dara Torres, her story? So she was in her early 40s, and she was I don't know if it was her 4th Olympics or her 5th Olympics, but she was in her 40s, and she was doing incredibly well. So somehow the conversation got started of, oh, Ginny, maybe you should train again. And I was like, ridiculous. So, but I was going to a personal trainer at that point, mostly because that was my 50th birthday year. When you're that age, for all you young people, sorry, bad news is you really do have to work to stay fit. You need something to keep it interesting. So I was going to a personal trainer. And after the Olympics, I was hanging out and talking to her, doing a workout. And I said, so I was watching Dara Torres, and she goes, oh, you should start training again. You should go for 2012. And so this was starting to become a theme. So I thought, really? So I went home, and I wrote a list of pros and cons. Why was this a good idea, and why was this a bad idea? And on the list of pros were things like, you know how to do it, you know what it takes to be an Olympian, you actually know how to win a medal, you have a little more time. That was really not true. I was working full-time the whole time I trained, but now I was working and I had children and a partner, so it was life is a lot more complicated. But I also had a little more financial flexibility. And one of the things that you really need is you need a whole community of support. You need coaches, masseuses, all that stuff. So I thought, okay, that's a plus. And then the list of cons, there were 3 cons. I was short, I was asthmatic, and I was 50. And so I looked at the list and thought, oh, 2 out of 3. I had those 2 when I was in my 20s, so it's only the age, so what the heck. So then I thought about if there was one thing I could change from when I was younger, what would I change? And I was really terrified always whenever I started racing. Going off the line, the first 30 strokes was incredibly hard. And I rode in a lot of team boats, but my favorite rowing show actually was the single. I rode for the U.S. In the World Championships in 1983 in the single, and I loved it. And that was my goal for '84. I will not tell you why that did not happen. It's in the book. But it was really hard in a single to get off the line by myself. I was always terrified that it would hurt so much I would just stop. So I decided in 2008 you could hire sports psychologists, which were not available in 1980, whatever. In fact, they didn't even have heart rate monitors when I was training in the early 80s. Okay, that's how long ago it was. So I found this guy. His name was Mike Gervais. He now works with U.S. Olympians, and he works with the Seattle Seahawks. No Brady comments here. I won't say anything. So I wrote him an email and said, I don't know if you want to work with me. And he read my email and called me and said, I want to work with anyone who's interested in the pursuit of excellence. So I was like, okay. So we started talking to each other about every week. He was down in LA. And I told him what I wanted to work on, which was this whole issue of being terrified. About a month into this, he said to me, something unexpected is probably going to come from this. And I was like, yeah, whatever. I want to make the team, and I want to see if I can win a medal. So I trained really hard for 6 months. I was doing 2-a-days. It was great. I lost a bunch of weight. I got stronger, but I was exhausted. It was like I was working. I had 2 of my kids were still at home. And there was a day in March. So I went from September to the middle of March. I scheduled 2 events that day. There was going to be some rowing, like speed orders in my rowing club that I was racing in. But before that, there was this event called the Big Climb, which was you would run up the tallest building in Seattle, which is about 67 flights. So it wasn't, it was about 10 or 12 minutes. And I had done it a couple of years earlier when my oldest son was a high school senior, and he was a rower, and he had challenged me to do it with him. So I had done it, so I had a baseline time. So I got up, I first did the Big Climb at 7, and then I went and raced at 9. And I sucked at both, basically. My time in the Big Climb was slower than it had been 2 years ago. And the boat felt terrible. It was just awful. And then I did something I've never done, which was I didn't go to the boathouse for 2 weeks. Now you have to understand, I always did what I said I was going to do. It didn't matter how hard the training workout was, I was going to do it. And I realized that I had left something off the list of, pros and cons, and that was desire. And I discovered after those 2 weeks, I just didn't want to do it enough. I had already accomplished what I needed to accomplish as a rower, as an athlete, and it was no longer interesting. Yes, it was hard. Yes, it was physically challenging, and to a certain extent, mentally challenging. But if you don't love something enough to go through all the really hard parts, you're just not going to be able to do it. And you would have thought by age 50 I would have known that, but as it turns out, I didn't. So I quit. And it took a little bit to get used to the idea that I was stopping working on a goal that I had set for myself. But this guy, Mike Gervais, didn't stop talking to me. He kept talking to me all the way through the next year. And I asked him at one point, why is he still talking to me? And he said, I'm really interested in working with people who are interested in the pursuit of excellence. So as we kept talking, it started to come out that I had always had this dream about writing. And we talked then. Then my fear started morphing into, well, I don't know that I can do this. I've never done it before. And he got me through this whole idea of, really, you're going to let your fear stop you. And I decided I was going to learn to write, and I was going to write about rowing. I mean, so really, this whole quest for the third Olympics turned into a huge opportunity to remember all the great stuff about rowing. I mean, rowing was still great, actually. I didn't like doing speed work, the painful stuff, but being on the water was amazing, even though I was in Seattle. I rowed in New Haven, actually Derby, Connecticut, and then I rowed 5 years on the Charles. And I'm sorry, I love Seattle, but rowing out there is horrible. And it's much nicer rowing on rivers where you're not competing with tugboats. I'm very spoiled, I admit it. So I decided to take the plunge and really try to tell the story of why I became an Olympian and what it took to become an Olympian. And it was, in many ways, writing is like rowing, it's like training for rowing. Because the hardest part of doing any workout is getting to the workout, is actually the first step, getting yourself on the water or on the erg or going for a run. For me, once I'm in it, I can do it. And the hardest part about writing was sitting down and picking up, either the keyboard, or I did a lot of handwriting, is just getting started. So for me, that I was well trained in terms of the discipline. And because of my experiences with Harriet the Spy and my early writing, I really loved the writing process. I loved how hard it was. And I think I wrote this book for two reasons. One, because of the challenge of could I put together a story that was interesting and well written? I love books. And I didn't want to just write something that people said, okay, it's a memoir by someone who thought she had something to say but didn't do a very good job. I really wanted to write something that people felt was well put together. So I was very lucky. There's a place in Seattle called Hugo House, which anybody who wants to write can go. It's a nonprofit and take classes. And so I started in 2009, and within a year I had written about 100 pages, and they were terrible. I couldn't get the story beyond. I didn't know how to move it forward. It kept coming back on itself. So I was taking a class with this woman. It turned out she was my age. All the other instructors were like in their 20s. And they were great. They certainly knew their stuff, but it was a little hard for me to connect with them. And then this woman came along, and she was really interesting and very good. And it turned out that she worked with people who are writing their own books, and she was an editor. So I asked her if she'd work with me, and she said sure. And so she gave me this long questionnaire, asking me how I like to work with people. And my big thing is, don't lie to me, tell me the truth. I'd much rather hear how bad it is than have you pretend. And so she loved that. And then I gave her my first 100 pages, and she didn't love those. And she said, great, let's start over. That was the first meeting. Let's start over. I was like, really? But I learned so much. And one of the things I learned is how much thinking you get to do in advance, really, about what do you want the arc of the story to be. I didn't even know what the arc of the story meant. But she really taught me to think about what were the themes. And she also had the big question of, what's this about? Is this a story about your mother? Is it about you? And so there was a lot of clarity. And you'll see if you decide to read the book that it's really a book. It's my story. It's not my story about my family. And of course, my family is part of it. So it was really, and of course, even though I'm a single sculler, I view myself as a single sculler, even though I competed for 10 years and it was only part of my career. One of the reasons I had always been really afraid of writing was I don't do a lot of things by myself. I mean, when I go for walks, I have 2 dogs, right? I mean, I like to be around living, breathing creatures. And this woman made writing a collaborative process. All the words are mine, but she was someone who I could call up, I could email when I was struggling, and she'd always be really positive. But she was also honest. And she said, the odds of this getting published are very, very small. And the reason it got published is that she had my editor was a published writer, and her wife was a published writer who had an agent. And she suggested to her agent that she might want to read my manuscript. Well, it turns out this agent has 4 children, and 2 of them are rowers. So, and she ended up reading part of the story to her son, he was, I think, a senior at Cornell at that point, because she just wanted to know, was it true? And he was like, yeah, that's rowing. So she decided to take me on, and really, Beacon Press, it took her about 14 or 15 months to sell the book, and Beacon Press picked it up, and I'm really grateful. So it's been quite a journey. One of the things that's, for me, that's important about this book, and the other reason I wrote it, besides loving and kind of the personal challenge, and one more thing I'll say is, in my 20s, I didn't discover this until my 50s, I didn't realize how much of my kind of intellectual capacity, if you will, was diminished by training. I was exhausted all the time. I worked full time the whole time I trained. But when I was in my 50s and really digging into this very, demanding process from a mental perspective, I realized how much of an edge I had missed in my 20s. So I was, again, glad to be able to do this kind of work older, when I really had the mental energy to tussle with ideas and sentence structure, and also doing some research. But some people who have read this book have said, was this a hard book to write? Because there are some unhappy moments. I mean, this is not the story of an idyllic life. I have a great life, but there were some really rough moments there. And my experience of people is I learn more about people and connect more with people when I hear their stories of their vulnerability and their woundedness. I mean, whenever we meet each other, we're always flashing our credentials, right? We always put our best foot forward. But what makes me feel connected to people is when I hear about the things that didn't go well and the struggles that they've had to go through to, in some senses, recover themselves and recover their way, and who they've become as a result. So it's kind of, I feel like people were afraid to share our woundedness with each other. And yet that's really where connection comes from, because really we are all not necessarily on exactly the same path, but life is pretty democratic in terms of giving us a tough row to hoe. Maybe not at the same period in our lives, maybe not the same difficulties or the same obstacles, but pretty much if you live long enough, you're gonna encounter hardship, struggle, tragedy, and if you live short enough, that's a tragedy in and of itself. So this book is really an attempt to connect with other people who might be, especially younger people, who might be having their own struggles in their own lives, and might be able to read this and think, if she did it, I can do it. Because that's really how I decided to become an Olympian. The first time I saw a rowing shell was this race in Boston. Many of you probably know it, the Head of the Charles. And I decided on the spot I wanted to become a rower. And when I started college, my freshman year, there were 2 women who were training for the 1976 Olympics. And 1976, thanks to the Canadians, women's rowing was put into the Olympics. And back in those years, host countries could add one sport when they were hosting. That's completely changed now. So women's rowing started in 76. And in the US, because of that, women's rowing really started to grow. So there were these two women at Yale. They had rowed in the 1975 US national team. They'd won a silver medal in Nottingham. One was the captain of my crew. The other was a junior. And I just looked at them and thought, I mean, I do not know why human beings think this way, but I thought, oh, if they can do it, I can do it. I was 5'7". I was asthmatic. I had gone jogging in high school, played basketball in 9th grade, broke my ankle, never went back to it. So that was kind of the extent of my athletic pursuits. And then I finally told my coach my junior year, and he told me I was too small and I'd never make an Olympic team. So, you know, there were some challenges along the way. Anyway, I think I've talked enough. If you guys have questions, I'd love to answer them. Sure, go for it, David.
Two questions. One, talk about what it takes to become an Olympic athlete, and two, where you see the trajectory of women's sports going.
What does it take to become an Olympic athlete? Okay, I think the first thing is you really have to want it. I have a daughter who was a Division I soccer player and who probably could have gone on. And she was starting to burn out, actually, as she finished high school. And I said to her, Sierra, you know, you could go, you know, Women's World Cup, you could do that. And she looked at me and said, why would I want to do that? And I thought, okay, just shut up now, Ginny. She doesn't want to. Now, she doesn't realize what she's missing out on, or that, you know, not many people have that capacity. And she very well may not have had it. But the truth was she didn't have the mental capacity. And that's the first thing, is you really have to want it. And it cannot feel like a sacrifice. It has to feel like a choice that you're making every day, and that you are really, for me, I always felt like I was lucky to get to do this thing I loved. And I would go to work in the morning after having rowed, and I would look around at all these people working, and I would feel so sorry for them, because what had they done? And who knows? I mean, maybe some of them had gone out and rowed. I don't think so, but you know, I'm sure they had very nice lives. But I loved it. I lived for it. And now my son rowed, my oldest, for 9 years, and I thought, my God, it is the most boring spectator sport in the world. But, you know, I just loved it, and I think that's the first thing. And the second thing is you need a community around you who believes in you. Whether or not you've accomplished anything, it's much easier to be great and to go for great if you have people who believe that it's possible before you show them. Having to prove it to earn the respect is really, really hard in life. It was the way I went, not by choice, until I met a coach who actually believed in me, and then I could perform. It's very interesting psychologically. And of course it's hard, you have to set up your life and all that stuff, but from my perspective, the mental piece is probably the most important. And there are a lot of sports where you just have to be gifted athletically. I'm not sure that rowing is one of them, although now obviously size does play a part, but so much of rowing is about what goes on in your head. So, okay, second question was mental trajectory of women's sports. You want to be a little more specific?
We just saw the Women's World Cup, and the winners got $2 million. The Men's World Cup got $3 million.
Well, the answer lies with all of you. If you want women's pro sports out there, you got to go. You got to do what the guys do, which is, you know, for all those baseball fans who sign up and buy season tickets for 81 games and maybe go to 20, we got to support our women's teams, not only at the pro level, but also, who was I talking to? 5-year-old daughter playing soccer. Immediately already, the boys are getting the best field times, the boys are getting the best fields. That starts in our country very, very young. You look at high school sports in Texas, what's the big sport? It's always guys' right? It's football. So there is kind of a cultural inequity built into all our communities across the country. It's not just the middle of the country, it's the whole country where there is this inherent bias for boys and men as athletes. And we have to undo that right there. Why is it that even in college games, many, many more people go to watch college men's basketball than women's. Why is that? Usually that's just parents and friends, right? So we send a message to our females at a very young age, and that's really up to all of us. So the World Cup, you can accuse the powers that be that they made a mistake, but the fact is they're following the trend. They're not trying to lead the trend. And you could argue about whether they should be a little more proactive, but they're going where the money is. And still, the average American fan is not yet interested in women's sports.
Ginny, how did you overcome your asthma?
How did I recover? Overcome it. Well, I overcame it by not denying it. I really spent my first year at Yale, I ignored it. My second year, I ended up really quite sick and had to start taking medication. So I ended up taking medication every day, twice a day, the entire time I trained. And then when I came back to train in 08, when I came back to train for 2012, I ended up on medication again, and I'm on it still. And I'm careful. I'm aware of what I'm allergic to, but exercise is one of the best antidotes to asthma. So it's really important, actually, if you're asthmatic, to work out. Yeah?
What do you recommend for a beginner shell?
You mean what kind of a rowing shell?
Yes, that actually would be like on a, not rivers, not ponds.
So open water?
Yeah, open water, or even like we have some ponds that are not, little contained.
Okay, so I row out in the U.S. on Puget Sound, North End, and I have Moss rowing shells. I'm going to turn to this guy. What do you guys use?
Moss 24s, arrows. We start people out in the pulling boat with P&OC rigs.
If you want to row here, there's your guy. So, okay, sure.
I appreciate your comment about sharing your woundedness, sharing our woundedness to connect with people. Just wondering, when about in your life you came to that realization in terms of connecting with people? Was it a young age?
No, it was not a young age. My kind of way of working in life, and this got me through the Olympics, was I was very able to focus on one thing. So I decided I wanted to be an Olympian, and that was what I went for. And anything that conflicted with that, I just got out of the way. I handled so that I could focus on the Olympics. I was really kind of a hard ass, didn't have much compassion for people. So it probably took into my 40s when I lived enough life and started to realize the cost of living with such blinders on. Now, going back to your question about what it takes to become an Olympian, I actually don't think you have to do that to be successful, but that was what I had to do emotionally to kind of keep myself on track. And I always thought that I had to be tough. And one of the reasons I started rowing, was because I needed to prove to myself that I could survive. And what that also meant to me was denying the soft spots. So it took a while, unfortunately. Or maybe not, unfortunately. Anybody else? Yeah?
To put you on the spot, but have you ever thought about engaging with the Women's Sports Foundation and become a leading national figure advocating for women's sports?
Never thought of it. But come on, give me some credit. I am one of 3 women who owns the WNBA's Seattle Storm. I'm on the board of governors. We're one of 2 franchises that are owned by women. So it's not like I'm doing nothing. And I'm, involved in a sport that, frankly, I'm involved in the sport because of the intersection of business and social justice, not because I'm an avid basketball player. In fact, when we bought the team, my wife, she wasn't my wife at the time, thank you, Supreme Court, gave me Basketball for Dummies. That was how little I knew. And our coach, the first time I met him, asked me what a point guard was. And a post player. And I had studied, I knew the answer, but I was so flustered and shocked, I couldn't answer the question. I know what a post player is, I know what plays are now, but still, I miss a lot when I watch those games. Anyone here who's played basketball knows more than I do. So, but not in the Women's Sports Foundation. I'm certainly a fan and have donated. So, anyone else? I think it's real.
Yeah. I mean, I do too. I'm in the early 60s. And I tell my kids, don't tell me 60 is the new 40. I'm telling you what 60 is. There's a difference from what I could do at 40. But
Absolutely. And I mean, there's the whole issue of what happens, certainly for women, when you go through menopause. You can't control your body the way you could. But I mean, obviously, we're having to learn that we can't do everything we used to. It's one of the reasons, frankly, that I stopped rowing and don't really do it recreationally, is because I still remember how good it felt, and I just can't stand how bad it feels. And it's not that rowing feels bad; it's just it doesn't go as fast. But it's a factor. All the science shows you lose your lung. Even if you train hard. I train hard. I did ride around Mount Rainier the day before I came here, 150 miles, 10,000 feet of elevation climbing. I mean, I'm still an athlete, but I'm not fast. So it's just the way of the world. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
no, I agree. Everybody else here, I keep doing it. And
I can
finally
tell.
realize I'm an athlete. Okay, I'm not a competitive athlete now, but you just keep doing it.
Right,
Be a little smarter,
right.
and you're slower. That's it.
If you don't mind me asking, what was your best 2K?
I have no idea. So again, let me remind you, what was my best 2K time? So gamut ergs were what I trained on, and the concept 2 was not invented when I started rowing. Yeah, so I have no idea what my 2K time is. And not only that, when I was, I held the head of the Charles record in the women's single for 30 years. It was broken 2 years ago. But, there were really, all that stuff was not around. So concept 2 oars weren't around. They were all invented afterwards. So I can't help you. And we rode, the reason I told you about the head of the Charles, sorry, bad memory. Women rode in the Olympics through 84, 1,000 meters. So it switched to 2K in 85. I was a much better endurance rower. But when I was training for the Olympics, it was 1,000 meters. Because us women, we can't survive that long. I think we can take one more question.
Well, I was just going to say that, rowing, it's like age group categories. All you got to worry about is beating yourself and then everybody, it's like the people rowing into the 80s and up to 90s.
Absolutely true. Ernestine Bear was the first woman who I ever saw row. And there's no question about it. And that's one of the great things about rowing, and I'll probably close with this, that it's really about testing yourself. And for me, that's really the heart of sports. It's not about beating someone else. And Harry Parker had that great quote, which I cannot exactly even get close to, but it was basically, rowing is not a game. And it's really true. It's a completely different experience, a very different endeavor. And if you haven't ever gotten out in a boat, even if you have no interest in racing, it's definitely an experience you should go for. So anyway, I want to thank you guys so much for coming. Oh.